Sometime back, I was working with a couple preparing for marriage. And as you might expect, one of the things I always encourage them in is their faith journey. I explain to them that there are foundations that will bless and be a part of your new life together. You know, things like communication, things like respect, of course, love and affection. And one of the things that I was talking to them about is that faith will bless your relationship as they're starting their lives out together. It's not only been my experience. Social scientists have studied this, and one of the things that strengthens a relationship more than any other is regularly worshiping together. So I was encouraging them in this way, and we started talking a little bit about their faith journey. And the young man told me that years ago, with a different girlfriend, he had gone to her church on Easter morning, and the pastor had an altar call. If you're not familiar with an altar call, it's a time in a service where you raise your hand or you come forward and you say, I want Jesus to be part of my life. And this young man described that he had done this years ago. And as we talked about that, I asked him, well, what then? You know, what happened after that? And he said basically nothing. You know, he'd given his life to Christ, but there hadn't been any next steps in his faith journey. He'd kind of gotten stuck in that place. And sometimes that happens in our faith. I want to look at a scripture passage, and there's a part of it that really reminds us of how we can get stuck. It's found in the Gospel of Matthew, although as well the story is in the Gospel of Mark and also Luke, and it's made reference to in the letters of Peter, who was there at this event. We're going to read this from Matthew, the 17th chapter. And we hear 6 days later. Whenever I read that, when I'm starting to read something, I think, well, what happened? So I turn back to chapter 16 to find out what happened 6 days before. And it was actually a story we looked at a couple weeks ago. It was the occasion when Jesus and the disciples were in Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus asked them, who are people saying that I am? And then he asked them who the disciples say that he is. And Peter's the one who says, you're the Messiah. And Jesus starts to explain what that means, that he would go to the cross, that he would suffer and die on the cross. And Peter's like, no, Lord, I don't want that to happen. And that's when Jesus rebukes him and says, Peter, you are setting your mind on human things, not on God things. And we see some spirit of that event in this one here. So 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, three of his closest disciples, and he led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured. Literally, transfigured means your image, your figure changes. He is transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Of all the miracles that Jesus performs, this is one of the most amazing, that he's shining bright there, and suddenly there appeared with him Moses and Elijah, two of the greatest leaders of the Jewish faith, appear there with him, and they are talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. It's like he wants to build some houses there, or maybe even like a shrine or a temple up on the mountain, you know, the Church of the Holy Transfiguration to celebrate this. But Peter's suggestion is pretty much just ignored. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son." The very voice of God speaks out about Jesus. This is my son, the beloved. I love that. You know, that Jesus, when he refers to God, he calls God the Father, or at one occasion he called him Abba, that means like Papa or Daddy. And in return, God refers to Jesus as the beloved. With him, I am well pleased. Listen to him. It's almost like, no, Peter, you haven't got it. Just listen to him. Just follow what Jesus tells you. And when the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and they were overcome by fear. Little wonder. But Jesus came and touched them and saying, get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. You know, my heart often goes out to Peter. I think he wants to be such a good disciple. He's always trying, and yet so often he's getting it wrong. He's got this idea, this is such a great and glorious event. Let's build a shrine. Let's stay up here and celebrate and stay in this moment. It's tempting to get stuck there. But that's not what Jesus wants at all. And think about it for a minute. If they had built a shrine up there, if they just stayed in that moment and celebrated that moment, think of all the things that wouldn't have happened. The miracles that Jesus went on to perform, the healings that he went on that convinced people to follow him. Think about the fact that if they had stayed up there on the mountain, Jesus ultimately wouldn't have gone into Jerusalem and wouldn't have went to the cross. The ultimate reminder for us of God's love. And having not gone to the cross, he wouldn't have been resurrected. All of that if they had just gotten stuck there on the mountain. See, I think like that young man, it's too easy to kind of get stuck in our faith journey. I think of it a little bit like the laws of motion. Even if you're not a physics kind of person, you probably learned at one point, an object at rest tends to stay at rest. But an object in motion tends to stay in motion. That's why the basketball up here this morning, if it's just stuck there, there's not much going on. But if there's a little bit of motion, then there's some opportunity for things to happen. Kind of moves around. I think in our faith, if we just we get stuck. Oh, well, I gave my life to Christ, but that's it. Or I went on a great serving opportunity, and that's it. Or I read through the entire Bible, and that's it. Our faith, God can't nudge and guide us when we're in motion, when things are happening. That's when things get exciting. I mean, really, isn't that like every good relationship needs to be dynamic? It needs to stay in motion. I mean, I try and be a good husband around the house. But if I say to my wife, well, I took out the trash 15 years ago, she's going to be like, who cares? The trash needs to go out tonight, right? I mean, it needs to be ongoing. I mean, if I say to my wife, oh, well, I bought you a present 5 years ago, isn't that enough? They're like, no. It needs to be ongoing. If I say to my wife, well, I said I love you on our wedding day, I don't need to say it again. I am going to be in serious trouble, right? It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be continuing. And our relationship with Jesus needs to be the same way. Sometimes we get a little lost. Sometimes we go down the wrong road. Sometimes we wander a little bit. But if we stay in motion, Jesus has the opportunity to nudge and encourage and lead us along the way. It's too easy sometimes to get stuck. What does that look like for you to stay in motion, to keep moving along in your faith journey? I actually had a conversation with a guy just recently about this and was kind of nudging him in his faith journey. And one of the things that I reminded him, one of the regular examples I use is that our faith practices, we can be reminded of them by our hand. By our hand. We all have our hand. Keep it with us every day. Your hand can remind you of some basic ways to stay in motion. Your tallest finger, if there's only one thing that you're doing in your faith, a devotional time, a little time of prayer, and a little time of reading some scripture will be a huge blessing. We just ended a series on mindfulness and all kinds of practices in the midst of that. To try them out is a little bit of motion and see where God will lead. Or this season of Lent that starts this week, the materials that I mentioned to read daily in the Gospel of John is just a little bit of motion. Maybe God will say something as you read and you pray through the Gospel of John that you've never heard before, that little bit of encouragement along the way. A lot of folks give something up for Lent, but you can add something as well. Maybe even in the time and space you would have done whatever the other thing was you gave up you didn't need to do anyway. What's that little thing that God will nudge you forward? Or going back to our hand, our pointer finger kind of points up and reminds us to worship. Maybe in this season of Lent, you'll say, you know what? I'm going to make sure that I'm in worship every week as I'll be preaching through the Gospel of John, and you'll learn some of those stories of John. Maybe you'll hear something that you absolutely need to hear in just that little bit of motion along in your faith journey. Or our thumbs remind us to be in service. It's what makes us unique in the animal kingdom. The opposable thumb allows us to pick things up and handle things. We always encourage at St. Paul's that you find some way to be of service, some way that God is going to use you. In fact, in your bulletin is a goldenrod insert that has 17 different opportunities to get involved. And then at the bottom, there's a blank space. If you don't see what you want on there, we can talk about that. Joining something, getting involved with something, trying something you haven't been involved is an opportunity to a little bit of motion. Where will you lead? Where will you take me, God? In service. Or back to the hand, our ring finger reminds us of relationships. Connect with somebody that you've never talked with or never talked about faith with. We'll have some groups where there's opportunities to get deep into the Gospel of John. In particular on Wednesday evenings, not this Wednesday, but the following ones, we'll be watching a movie version of John and then talk about that. An opportunity to meet somebody else and hear their perceptions of faith. Or what if you just said to somebody that you admire their faith, hey, I'd like to go have coffee and talk a little bit about what I see in you. What a blessing that would be. What kind of motion would that take you in? Or back to our hand, our pinky reminds us to be giving. Scriptures tell us that where our treasure is, where we're giving, that's where our hearts are. Maybe giving to something new in the season of Lent will just nudge you down the road a little bit. Or if we reach our whole hand out and shake hands with somebody, it's a reminder to encourage and lift somebody up in their faith journey. What if you just kind of encourage someone along their journey? And teachers know this. Whenever you teach, you have to be deeper in the subject. You'll be thinking about your own faith as you encourage and help somebody else along in their faith journey. Let me end with this image. It's a good way to think about making progress, always going forward in our faith, and it's pretty funny too. Years ago, my wife and I were in a very upscale mall near where I grew up. And one of those open sections of the mall, whoever designed this toy store was either really cruel or had a fantastic sense of humor, because it had a big glass wall in front of it. It was just literally an accident waiting to happen. And my wife and I, there was a young family that came into that section, and there was this little guy, couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, and he saw the toy store, and he broke loose for the family. You could just see this happening. Toys! Straight for the toy store. He literally bounced off of the glass wall and hit the ground. It was all we could do not to break up laughing. But then, you're expecting tears and crying and screaming and parents running over. Not at all. He was right back up. Where's the door? Where's the door? I got to get inside. Didn't faze him at all. What a great reminder for all of us. Nothing's slowing me down, God. Wherever you want me to be, whatever you want me to be doing, I'm there. Right? I mean, what would that be like if we had that kind of attitude in our faith and for us together as a church? Right? Can I get an amen to that? Amen.